I'm delighted today to welcome our guest speaker, Laxmi Patel, partner at Boyce Turner. Laxmi is an expert in SEND law, and she's going to be sharing lots of really helpful tools and tips to navigate the EHC process. So I'm going to hand over now to Laxmi.
Hello, thank you for joining me this afternoon. So I've been given half an hour to go through some legal advice and practical support in relation to EHCPs. So not a great deal of time, but as Dan has said, I'm happy to take any questions at the end, and if there's no time left at the end, to follow up as well afterwards. So let's crack on. So this is just a little bit about myself. We won't spend too much time on that. But you can read up on it later if you wish. This is the content, and this is what I'm going to be covering today, which is essentially setting out where you can find the law around EHCPs, requesting an EHC needs assessment, again, very briefly going through the law around that and how you can sort of practically get yourself ready to request an EHC needs assessment, really understanding your plan as well. So understanding what the different sections of the plan stand for, and your legal rights in relation to each section of the plan, and then at number 4, talking about the level of detail that's required in an EHCP. So when you get the draft EHCP, what are you looking out for? Also knowing what you want to achieve. So that's really important as well. I find sometimes parents are not too sure about what they actually want to gain from the EHCP. I'll talk also briefly about how you can gather evidence, and then preparing for the annual review. Obviously, if you have an EHCP, it will be reviewed annually in most cases, and what to expect following on from an annual review. And then I'll go on to challenging decisions at the SEND Tribunal. Obviously, half an hour for this webinar, so I'll only be touching on that, but I'll give you the headline information, and then other things that you can do if you don't want to appeal, how you can challenge decisions in other ways, and then just lastly ending off the presentation. So kicking off then, knowing the law. Obviously, you're here to hear a solicitor talking about SEN and EHCPs. The law when it comes to EHCPs is fairly succinct and easy to find, in my view. And essentially, it's under Part 3 of the Children and Families Act. And that sets out in broad information about what the law is trying to achieve, I would say, but the details are in the SEND regulations 2014, so that fleshes out the actual act itself. Then you have other regulations, which here I've set out the personal budgets regulation, and then we've also got the first tier recommendations power, which is whereby the tribunal can make recommendations in relation to the social care and health aspects of the EHCP. And they are non-binding recommendations that the tribunal can make, but it is expected that those recommendations are by and large carried through by the authorities. There's also the SEND Code of Practice, which is probably a very good starting point for many parents and practitioners and schools. It is a SEND Code of Practice. It is guidance only, so just be mindful of that. But it's a far more readable sort of format rather than the actual law itself. And Chapter 9 is the chapter that actually sets out the information about assessment in EHCPs. Under Section 77 of the Children and Families Act, anybody working around EHCPs, local authorities, schools, etc., they must have regard to the guidance in the Code of Practice. So they mustn't sort of deviate from that unless they have good reasons to. And also, just a word of caution is just a reminder that local authorities often tell schools and parents about its own policies, but do remember that if it doesn't sound right, it's a good thing to check with the guidance and with the actual legislation, because they may just be local policies, which may not actually be the law. And remember, the Code of Practice will always carry greater weight, and the Children and Families Act and regulations will have the last say. So that is where you will find the law. Now, going on to requesting an EHC needs assessment. Requesting an EHC needs assessment, wanting an EHCP is not your first port of call. First of all, I would advise you to have a conversation with the school SENCO, and the school should be putting in a cycle of what we call assess, plan, do, review. So they ought to be sitting down with parents, looking at the child's needs, carrying out some assessments, making a plan about what provision and what support they are going to be putting in place, and then carrying out that support and then reviewing it. And this should be done with parents as well. And there should be several cycles of that where the school with the family are reviewing the support and looking at whether support needs to be amended, increased, different support needs to be put in place, and then to review that. And that needs to be a cycle of several of those sorts of assess, plan, do reviews. If at the end of that it's felt that no matter what the school's doing, there aren't sufficient improvements, or there's not enough understanding perhaps of the child's needs, then the school and or parents would be looking at requesting an EHC needs assessment. And generally, if the child or the young person is failing to make the expected progress, then it's either the school or the parents can request the assessment. Local authorities will expect to see evidence of the SEND support that the school has put in place. So if parents are making that request, then they really ought to be having a conversation with the school first to make sure that the school has been putting this sort of assess, plan, do, review cycle in place, and also to start to sort of collate what evidence they have to show the support that they have been putting in place, because the local authority will want and expect that information coming from the school. Now, Section 36, subsection 8 of the Children and Families Act says that the local authority must secure an assessment if the child or young person has or may have special educational needs, and it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made in accordance with a plan. So there are two mays as part of that test. It's a two-part test. The first part of the test is fairly straightforward, and generally families don't have problems with that part of the test. The second part is where it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made in accordance with the plan. And that is usually the one that parents fall short, where parents have to show evidence, or the school has to show evidence that the support that's been put in place, or that the child or young person needs, is beyond that which a maintained mainstream school would be able to provide from within its own budget. For young people over 18 years, there's also an additional need to consider if additional time is going to be needed to complete their educational training in comparison to the majority of others of the same age who don't have special educational needs. So, as I said, do get the school support if possible. At least have a conversation with the school if parents are putting in the request themselves. The request is written either to the director or head of children's services, and the local authority must respond within 6 weeks. And what you would be putting into your request for an EHC needs assessment is listing the child or the young person's difficulties and evidence of those difficulties. So here you would be looking at school reports, individual education plans, showing the cycle of assess, plan, do, review, any exclusions if there have been any difficulties, any therapist reports as well, medical reports, diagnoses as well. Now, where the child or young person has made progress, you need to show evidence that it's been made as a result of a lot of additional support at a sustained level over and above that which is normally provided in school. So sometimes it's difficult. Parents will say to us that they've been putting all this support in place at home, therefore their child's not falling behind cognitively perhaps, but it's only because parents have actually put in a huge amount of support themselves. And then also remember the second part of the test, Also list why you feel that an EHCP may be needed. So here it's a good idea to list the types of therapies, specialist teaching, additional support, etc., that might be needed, which is going to be above and beyond that which a mainstream maintained school is going to be able to provide from within its own resources. So that's the request for an EHC needs assessment. Now, obviously, if the EHC needs assessment goes ahead, if it's approved and it goes ahead, then the local authority will carry out the assessment. They will arrange for an educational psychologist and other therapists, possibly. They will arrange to get information from any consultants, medical people, practitioners, and also social care as well. They will also write to you as parents, but also the school. They will gather all of that information and decide whether they are going to issue an EHCP. And if they are going to issue an EHCP, the whole process should take no more than 20 weeks maximum from your request to ending up with an EHCP, a final plan. Now, once you've got your final plan, you need to know what you're looking out for. So at some stage of the process, usually around week 15, 16, the local authority, if they are going to issue a plan, will send you a draft plan. And that is so that you can look at it and provide your feedback on it, and if there are any changes that you want made to the plan. So when you get that draft plan, it's a good thing to understand what you're actually looking at. So here I've set out the different sections of the plan. Section 8 will set out your views, and also the young person or child's interests and views as well. And this is from the information that they have gathered from the information that you've provided or any forms that you've completed as part of the EHC needs assessment. Section A, I always say, is a good introduction and general overview to your child's needs and what you're hoping to achieve. Section B and also section F and section I, as I've put in bold here, are the sections which can be challenged through a SEND Tribunal appeal if you want to have those sections updated, amended. So those are the sections really that you need to really focus on, because those are the sections that are legally binding. So section B is where it sets out the description of your child's needs. So what do they find difficult? Not about what they need in terms of provision, but what their difficulties are. Section C sets out any health difficulties that relate to your child's SEN. And section D sets out any social care needs, so any difficulties that the family may have, that you may have, that they may have in accessing their community, for example. That would be set out in section D. Section E would be the outcomes that are being sought, and there are outcomes in relation to education, health, and social care, and they need to be very smart. They have to be very specific. Section F is one of the sections which is often challenged at tribunal appeals, and that sets out any special educational provision. So any support that's set out and is required to meet the educational needs that have been set out under section B. So for every need that's described in section B, there has to be corresponding provision in section F to meet those needs. And that needs careful drafting and checking as well, but I'll go on to that in a later slide. And then section G will set out healthcare provision, and sections H will set out social care provision. So here, for example, you may have any respite, any additional support from social care for the family as well. Section I is often appealed at the tribunal, and section I sets out the type of placement. So here you'll be talking about whether it's a primary or secondary, whether it's a mainstream or special. So it's the type of placement and then the name of the school or college. And section J sets out details of a personal budget if one's requested and has been agreed. And section K will set out a list of all the advice or all the appendices to the EHCP. So, as I've said, do detail all the child's difficulties fully in section B, not just in section A, so that's something to look out for. And make sure, as I've said, that any needs in section B is matched with provision in section F. Outcomes, this is section E. Do remember the outcomes Some people find these very difficult to draft and what to look out for, but they must be very specific. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So what is the young person expected to achieve from the provision that's in place, and by when? And then also, yeah, so that's the whole of that slide. So know your plan fully and know what you're requesting when you get that proposed plan. So here I've just put a couple of outcomes as examples. This, for example, I'll just read out the second one, where your child will greet different people appropriately. This will include family members, her friends, unfamiliar adults, to be achieved by the end of Key Stage 2. So as clear as possible that you can be about what your child is going to achieve and by when, and how you're going to measure that as well. So when it comes to also the EHCP, especially section F, there is an element of detail that's required. This is often something that's been that's appealed by parents to the tribunal. So here I've got two cases which does set out what sort of specification is required to provision in EHCPs. And in essence, it's got to be so specific and so clear that there's no room for doubt as to what's been decided in terms of provision. So, for example, the case Oxfordshire said that even in a special school or a special resource base, there does have to be a high level of specificity. So, for example, if the EHCP says support from an LSA, well, then you need to put in place how much support is going to be provided by the LSA. For example, how many hours, during what lessons, whether the LSA needs any specialist training and experience as well. If you've got that information, put it in. And if you don't have that information, it might be something that you ask the local authority to find out and put into the EHCP. Something we often see in EHCPs is where it says a programme to be delivered to develop social communication, for example, or programmes of other types. Remember that a bare programme adds nothing and doesn't provide sufficient detail. So the contents of the programme may be needed here. But essentially, we're looking for figures. Figures are good. So, for example, 25 hours of one-to-one support, or perhaps it might be 1-2 support, or it might be X number of hours of direct therapy from a speech and language therapist, for example. And then you might also have how many indirect hours are needed by the speech and language therapist to, for example, provide training to school staff, and how often that training is to be provided. So a huge level of detail so that everyone knows exactly what is to be provided. And key points from the Oxfordshire decision was that, as I've said before, specification can't be abandoned, even in a special school. Sometimes it's said that we need some flexibility, but that's not a reason for not putting in specificity where detail could have been provided. And avoid vague, meaningless words such as opportunities, opportunities is a classic one that we see quite often in EHCPs. And any specialist staff, think about what qualifications they might need and training requirements as well. So the other thing I often say to parents is know what you're wanting to achieve. So look at the SEN in section B. Is it complete? Is it inaccurate? Does anything need to be updated? Look at the provision, quantification of that. Are there sufficient hours? Is it detailed enough? Is it the right type of support as well? So from any specialist therapists, specialist equipment, etc. And is there any support for educational training? Remember that training and education is very broad now. So it can include lots of things, not just the usual cognition type of provision. It may include training for managing yourself in a busy environment, for example. That, may be training of some kind, but training can encompass lots of provision. And also do think about whether teachers or school staff require training as well. The other thing to think about as well, is your child in the right school? Are you looking at a change of placement? Are you looking at a different type of placement? Have you found the school or college that you want to have named in the EHCP? Think about the peer group. Think about whether the current placement can meet needs, and think about all the other different types of placements that you may have. And it could be maintained, or it could be independent or non-maintained. It could be Section 41 schools or non-Section 41 schools. Section 41 schools are those that have elected to be included on a list of schools that can be named by local authorities. It doesn't mean that non-Section 41 independent schools cannot be named, but non-Section 41 schools do have to offer a place. And if they say no, they're not going to offer a place, then there's very little that parents can do to push back on that. But with Section 41 schools, we can still look at the reasons as to why the school is saying they cannot meet needs. Look at whether your child needs a day or residential placement. That's an option. And look at home education, but be aware as well that there is a difference between elective home education, which is where parents have chosen it, but the local authority hasn't agreed, and EOTAS, which is education other than at school, where it's agreed that the child cannot attend school. There is no suitable placement at present, and therefore the local authority will agree EOTAS, which means they will then fund provision that's set out in the EHCP and provide funding for a home education. And do remember that the EHCP can go up to 25 years, provided that learning outcomes haven't been met yet. So what to do when you are looking at annual reviews, or when you're putting your request for an EHC needs assessment in, or if you're appealing. You need to gather evidence, and this may come from all of these sources here, generally school reports, therapy reports, medical reports, correspondence with others, attendance records, and I've listed them all out here, but therapies, specialists, etc. And if you are looking at a change of placement or change of type, do visit other placements and get those assessments carried out. And if they have to offer a placement, make sure that those assessments and offers are with you before you request that, especially if it's an independent school. Make sure they can meet needs and offer that place if you are asking for a change of placement. So once you've got the EHCP, it will be reviewed at least annually, particularly if the child's over 5. If the child's under 5, then it will be reviewed more than once a year. But generally, it will be reviewed annually. So how do you prepare for an annual review? Again, the annual review will be looking at the EHCP, so all those sections of the EHCP which I've gone through already. But when you're preparing for an annual review, if there's something that you're not happy about and you're wanting to change, start to think about the evidence that you have to gather for that. Think about the level or type of support. Think about sometimes if an earlier interim review is needed, you can request an emergency or an interim review. So you don't have to wait, for the annual review. You may want to discuss with the SENCO and therapist to make sure that they are preparing a report and attending, or at least invited to attend the annual review and produce a report. And as I said, prepare your evidence. And you as parents may want to do that in writing. So it's in writing and can be shared with the local authority with the annual review papers. There are 2 specific deadlines following on from an annual review and ahead of transitions. For secondary schools, the local authority must have issued a decision with a new school named for the secondary placement by the 15th of February. And for post-16 placements, they must have done it by the 31st of March. How to prepare for annual reviews? Again, make sure, first of all, that it's been a year since the last annual review and doesn't go over a year. Go through the EHCP, mark up areas that you feel need changing or need to discuss. Make sure that you have any experts reports that you need for the annual review. Make sure all professionals are invited to attend the annual review, or at least asked to prepare a report. gather your evidence for any changes that you're wanting to have made. Make sure all reports are circulated to everyone at least 2 weeks before the meeting, and then follow up from the annual review. Make sure that you have a decision from the local authority within 4 weeks of that meeting. So this is what happens after the annual review, is that the school must send the annual review meeting notes to the local authority within 2 weeks, and then the local authority has to make a decision as to what they are going to do, and they have to let the local parents know within 4 weeks. If the local authority is amending the plan, they have to have issued the amendments together with the decision, and they have another 8 weeks to then issue a final plan, and parents will be given 15 days to respond to a draft plan. So if parents want to challenge a decision, so it could be a refusal to issue a plan, it could be a refusal to issue to agree an EHC needs assessment, or it could actually be against the content of the EHCP. First thing that parents need to do is they do have to consider mediation for the majority of appeals. An appeal can only be made where there is a mediation advisor who issues a certificate. You need to have that certificate when you're appealing. Consider whether you want to have social care and or health included in your education appeal. Remember that there are tight deadlines to appealing to the SEND Tribunal. Do not miss these. And remember that currently appeal processes are taking quite a long time unless you're looking at transition appeals, in which case the tribunal is trying to squeeze those in earlier. And remember that your appeal could also include a cease to maintain, whereby they have to, where the local authority is saying that it's no longer necessary, i.e. the EHCP is no longer needed because special educational provision is no longer required. And do remember that the majority of appeals are decided in favour of parents and or the child, so it's worth having a go. Other options, if you can't appeal or you decide not to go ahead, is to discuss it with the SENCO and therapists and see what they can do to assist in the meantime. Also, gather evidence and think about revisiting it at the next annual review. Do consider requesting an interim or an emergency review if things don't improve. And you may want to, depending on what the issues are, you may want to complain to the local authority and or the local government ombudsman. And I'm almost done, but I suppose that the main takeaway from this is to prepare. It's about the evidence that you're putting together. So evidence really from your request for an EHC needs assessment to preparing for annual reviews, if you're wanting any change of provision or change of school, even for your appeals as well. So get organised, get your papers in order, and think about that evidence and whether you have all the reports that you need. And when you're looking at transitions to secondary or post-16, etc., start to look at placements at least 2 years, I would suggest, before the move. It always takes time to go around and visit placements and then to compare as well. It's always good to visit more than once as well if you can. And then lastly, I'd say know your EHCP well, familiarise yourself with the law, and be prepared with your evidence in advance and appeal if you need to. And that brings me to the end. So I don't know if we have any questions, but I'm happy to answer any that you may have that have come through.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. You've packed a lot into a short amount of time, so thank you very much for that. We have had quite a few questions come through. We'll go through a couple, and then any that we don't get to, we can follow up with those individually. So one question we had through was, how do we evidence the support we provide at home?
I suppose it depends what you're providing at home, but it may be listing the evidence that you provide at home. If it's that you're providing a lot of help with homework above and beyond, you know, what other parents would be providing, it's actually just stating what you're providing. How many hours is it taking? Are there any special books that you're providing? Have you got tutors at home? I think listing the hours that are spent and going over things and keeping a diary would be helpful there.
Brilliant. And another one we've had through, can you have medical reports from private practitioners other than CAMS?
Yes, I would say yes. You can have any reports, private practitioners included. The thing is, though, that you share your information with the local authority and with the school, obviously, but it's ultimately the local authority that makes the decisions. And under the law, as it's written at the moment, the local authority only has to consider all the evidence in front of it. So that will include any of their own statutory therapist reports from the school. They also have to consider what parents submit as well, but it is only that they have to consider. So yes, while it's really important and the local authority has to consider it, they don't have to take on board what your therapists are saying or any independent therapists are saying. Okay, so I think it's a good thing to have them in so that at least parents know what they should be asking for. But you can't require the local authority to carry out what those independent experts have recommended. But definitely, if it goes to tribunal, it is another part of your evidence, which will be considered in the same way as any other evidence that the local authority may put forward.
Brilliant. I think that is very clear. Just conscious of time, so I think we might have to leave it there for the questions. But as I said, any that we've not got around to, we will we'll follow up individually after the session. So just to say a huge thank you to everyone for joining us, and Laxmi for such a thorough presentation. So our next session, that is on Friday next week, and that's with Jordana Smallwood, our head of sixth form, and that's going to be looking at work experience and how we can make that successful. So a link for signing up to that will be in the email afterwards. And as ever, you can use the QR code on screen to reach out to our outreach team if there is a specific issue that you're looking for support with. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining. We hope to see you again next Friday, and have a good rest of your afternoon.